But one of the main scientific groups that was a part of a lot of those processes is called the Json Group. And the Json Group was a scientific advisory, independent scientific advisory group that was established just soon after the Cold War was really getting its impetus. And during the development of those nuclear weapons, they had all of these chief scientists that they wanted to find a way to use them. And so what was established is something called the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA. Today, they've added defense to the beginning of it. So this is where you hear this word DARPA, which is kind of one of the engineers for research and projects that are very much more clandestine in their nature. And so this kind of works within the black budget side of the United States military. And these consultants were basically selected to be academics predominantly. These were professors, these were researchers, these were physicists almost exclusively who had an understanding of how to make and solve problems, but they were not necessarily part of the defense industry itself. They were not part of Raytheon. They weren't part of Lockheed Martin. So they didn't necessarily, they believed they could be unbiased in their consultations. So what happened is every 6 weeks out of the summer, they would meet in different places, generally in La Jolla, California. And they also at Catholic boarding schools and girls' schools and preparatory schools as well, which is where a whole lot of the Jesuits began to infiltrate this. And it turns into a different kind of creature all in of itself. And so these Json groups would meet together, and they were people that were solving problems and then offering basically a solution. They weren't necessarily the guys who went out in the field and did all of the experimentational groups. Occasionally that happened, but the Jasons oversaw a lot of what we today would know as the thermonuclear weapon systems, the missile defense systems, the ballistic platforms. Like, these were the guys who were helping to make those things reality. And so because of that, the Jasons also had families and wives and children who would come and live out there in La Jolla, California. And those children and wives began to create and cultivate something that was called the Junior Jason program. And this is where children were being groomed and utilized, people that had what was called polymaths, geniuses in a variety of skill sets, and they would interbreed with each other, right? It seems it's reasonable that if you're a very, very smart intellectual, you don't necessarily want to marry somebody who is not. And so they choose to do a lot of inbreeding, not the kind that you're thinking of with family members, but the kind of within the closed group.
Nathan, they also had a guy in, I think it was in the La Jolla region. He was very wealthy, and he started his own, he had an underground bunker, and he collected the sperm of Nobel laureates. And he was offering that to women so that they could procreate. He had a little cyber, thing. I think this was in 1980. I believe it was in La Jolla region or the upper part of San Diego.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So my family on my mother's side, they moved out there to Orange County as well, and they began to they were Luciferians let me back up. They were Jesuits, so they operated under the Knights of Columbus, but ultimately they were trained Jesuits. And the Jesuits, the core tenets of the Jesuits is an oath-enforcing militant arm of the Vatican, of the Holy Roman Empire. They are the left hand of the Pope, and there's 3 popes that operate at any given time. There's a white Pope. This is what everybody would think of as the normal Pope, the guy who drives around in his little white, Pope-mobile. Yep. And then you've got the gray Pope who operates in between those two. And then you have the black Pope who is the head of the Jesuit order. And they really are black robe priests.
Where in OC did you live? Because I lived in OC too.
So I didn't live there, but my family would go out there and travel out there. My mom grew up there in just outside of Laguna Beach, about 25 minutes outside of Laguna Beach, and maybe Laguna Niguel. Anyways. They set up down there because Disneyland was out there and because they were trying to procure a lot of the child pornography and the child exploitation rings. And that was one of the ways that they did that. We don't think of Disneyland and Universal Studios and Walt Disney. We don't think of them as necessarily scientists in the same way, but you got to understand the engineers that were a part of those systems. They had some of the most advanced technologies that were anywhere in the world when it came to robotics, when it came to animation, computer graphics. Like, this is literally what gave birth to so much of what we would think of as modern society's robotics, like the AIs, all of this stuff that we're talking about, all of the growth and the cultivation of that really came from Southern California up into San Diego, like you said, and San Francisco, Stanford Institute of Research and Stanford University. These were headed by the military but through the academic side of these equations. And so this Json Group was tasked with solving these problems for the military. And my family began to infiltrate that group and started trying to take the same training methodologies that were utilized with when it came to making super soldiers, people that could operate within the echelons of the United States military, and as consultants to then feed back information. Because when your currency is blackmail, when your currency is secrecy, that which is the major currency of the Reynolds family that I grew up in and of the Jesuit order, that is how they are able to make favors and broker deals. Because the real currency in Washington, D.C., and the real currency in Great Britain is not money. It's secrets, and it's power and control games. Because at the end of the day, these people live in a world where it is dog eat dog, where they are trying to climb their way to the top of a pyramid of power, and they're willing to compromise. It is that compromise that becomes the currency of this kingdom. And if you're not willing to compromise, you're not allowed to come in through the door, because then they don't have a means of leverage against you. And so if they can't control you through your price, they're going to find your vice. And these are the two main mechanisms that they use to leverage society and leverage individuals, to compromise them and get them to go within the direction of what they want to happen. And someone who for those of you that are interested in the Json Group more, there's a book that is written by this woman, Anne Finkenbeiner, and she wrote, this is called The Jasons, The Secret History of Science's Post-War Elite. And this is an invaluable research tool for those of you that are wanting to find out more about this secret society, scientific society that became publicized back in the 1970s. They were able to operate pretty clandestinely for a long time. But during the Vietnam War, what happened is they were brought in to oversee a project of trying to create a sensor barrier to shut down the Northern Vietnam's supply chain that was going on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They were trying to stop that, because up until then, the military strategy was just bomb them, just bomb all of everything. And they realized that the climate or the geography of Vietnam and of Laos was what's called karst topography, meaning there was full of caves. You could dig and tunnel into their hillsides and into their mountains incredibly easy. And so they were transporting materials and goods on a continual basis, even though these bombing campaigns were just relentless. Like, we dropped more bombs on Laos, a country we were not at war with, than we did in the entirety of World War II. All the bombs that were ever dropped in World War II, we dropped more on Laos than we did in any point in the time through the World War II, just for perspective, this kind of little hidden aspects of our history that most people don't know. But the Json project Json Group was brought in order to develop a strategy to stop it, to cut that trail in half. And so they started deploying sensors that would communicate. They would fly over and drop them out of an airplane, and they would drop them down. And some sensors were designed to listen, acoustic sensors. Some sensors were designed through magnets to be able to detect whether somebody had weapons or rifles and ammunition. And then they would communicate that to computers back at a certain specific base. Those computers then were showing the Air Force where people were moving back and forth. Then the Air Force would deploy planes to drop bombs and munitions, or artillery to drop strikes directly on those targets. And this was one of the methods that they used. Well, that whole secret project got publicized. And when that happened at the time, back in the 1970s, as you guys can remember, the anti-war sentiment was at its highest towards the late 60s and 70s. And so the culture of the scientific community thought this was detestable, and they really began to protest against. These were Nobel laureates, like you just said, Penny. A huge percentage of these guys from the Json projects become Nobel laureates over the course of their life. These are the smartest people, some of the smartest people, arguably, in all of the scientific community, and were well-known researchers. And so their names began to get published, their identities, their families began to get threatened, and it turned into no longer the kind of the dreamland years where they were everybody's hero in the 1950s and 60s. The Jasons were like the best of the best, but then they became these pariahs in society. And so they had to change some of their tactics and strategies on how they met and how they operated. And one of the things that began to get birthed out of that was something that was called the Json projects. And this is what the major focus shifted on in the Vietnam War. A project was launched called Operation Phoenix. Now, Operation Phoenix was a training program for assassinations and torture and extraction. And they began to release hunter-killer teams, special kill teams all across northern Vietnam, southern Vietnam, Laos. And their job was to use any means necessary in order to eradicate this is counterinsurgency warfare. This is what we would call counterterrorism today. but this is how they decided to do that. And they assassinated and butchered and killed anywhere from 400 to 600,000. When you actually go and interview guys who are part of the Phoenix Project, they list the numbers at 6 million.